2:43. Jonathan felt the men around him shift uneasily, sensing the fear that had settled over the group like a suffocating blanket. Hessians. The butchers of Long Island. So many of them, came a strained voice from right behind. Hessians. The mercenaries who killed for coin. Shut up, roared the corporal, trying to keep his voice under control. No talking. Stand your ground. Them's grenadiers, came another voice, unnaturally high. See how big they are? They're match cases. See them? Do you see that, boys? Grenadiers. As Jonathan watched, the enemy troops continued to pace themselves to the beat of the drum. He couldn't see the drummer or the player, but he knew they must be boys. Perhaps, he thought, they were younger than he. He wanted to see them, wanted them to be much younger. The Hessians continued to march. Keep your lines, the corporal shouted. Keep them. The men lifted their guns and pointed them straight down the road at the oncoming soldiers. Hold your fire till I tell you, the corporal shouted. Don't waste your shot. They're still too far. Jonathan couldn't take his eyes from the advancing troops. All of them had cleared the bend now, moving so steadily that Jonathan wondered if they saw that the road was blocked. But just as he had the thought, they came to a stop, and the smooth flow of their march broke with a clumsiness that momentarily eased Jonathan's tension. On his horse, the Hessian officer cantered forward, looking up the hill at the Americans. Jonathan hefted his gun a little higher. He glanced behind. His father's friend, his head glistening with sweat, was there. Aim low, the corporal cried, or your shot'll go high. Jonathan looked at his own gun. At the moment it felt light. He stole a look at the men around him. He saw their fingers flex, grip, release, and grip again. Where's your goddamn Snydertown committee, Corporal? Came a call. Why don't they come? Is there something we don't know? The corporal, never taking his eyes from the Hessians and keeping his back to his own men, said nothing. His horse, blowing out its breath, shifted nervously. Jonathan's mouth felt hard and dry, his tongue thick. A bad taste was in his mouth. Whom could he ask for a drink? Who wouldn't mind? He gazed about, trying to pick someone, thinking only that he was more thirsty than he had ever been in his life. But the men were all too fixed upon the road for him to ask. He didn't dare to speak. Down the road, the Hessians remained standing still. Only the officer on the horse was moving. Jonathan heard the sharp clop of its hooves. The officer's large mustache was turned up at either end. He carried no gun, but there was a sword in his hand that flashed in the steel-gray light. He kept looking up the hill, craning his neck now this way, now that. Jonathan suddenly realized that he had never seen an enemy soldier before. He had seen Tories, but hateful as they were only Americans. What he was seeing right before him were real enemies, foreign ones, the most awful ones, the cruel German-speaking kind. Down the road, the Hessian officer waved his sword and shouted something to his men. The drum began to beat again. The fife played high, reedy notes. From behind, Jonathan felt the wind cold against his neck. The gun, swaying, felt heavy. Spread out a bit, the corporal ordered. Don't give so much target. Everyone shifted. When I give the call, he continued, the first line fires, then the second moves on forward. You on the first line, you step back and load again. You get that? 2 rounds a minute, boys. 2. Jonathan's heart sank. 2 rounds a minute. He couldn't do it. He practiced more. The tramp of the soldiers cut through his regrets. Jonathan turned. The Hessians, their red and white legs moving in high-stepping, winking unison, had begun once more to advance. Their guns rose beside their golden caps. The sight made Jonathan dizzy. He swayed. The gun felt heavier. You all ready? He heard close to his ear. Jonathan turned. It was the Frenchman. He was standing next to him. Jonathan tried to answer, but found he had no voice. He nodded. "They are the big ones, certainly," said the Frenchman. "Steady, boys, keep steady," the corporal called, moving off to one side. "Remember, there's a storm coming. If it rains, keep your pans covered and dry. Wait till we've got 50 yards between us, boys. 50 yards or less. 50 yards or less." How far, Jonathan wondered, was 50 yards? How many feet was that? What spot would that be on the road? Would anyone tell him? Why didn't anyone tell him anything? "Don't they know," he said to himself, "that I'm the youngest here?" His heart beat with every stroke of the drum. The soldiers advanced to the self-same sound. If his heart stopped beating, Jonathan wondered, would they stop too? Watching, he couldn't believe how they came together, shoulder to shoulder, no one moving out of step, their legs lifting stiffly, perfectly. The Hessian officer shouted something. "What did he say?" asked one of the Americans. "Don't know." "What's he saying?" "Ready?" cried the corporal. Feeling the backs of his legs grow tight, Jonathan pulled his gun up. He tried to sight down along the muzzle, tried to remember to aim low, but was afraid to point down lest he lose the ball again. The gun lurched up, down, right and left. It took all his strength to keep it still. His back hurt. The Hessians kept coming closer. Should he aim at someone, he wondered? Who? He heard a click. The Frenchman had drawn back his flintlock. Jonathan pulled one of his hands away from his gun to do the same. The gun dipped dangerously. He grabbed the lock anyway, yanking back. It came with a snap. "Steady!" shouted the corporal. "Steady!" Jonathan was sure the corporal was shouting at him alone. He watched the blue coats, the crossed white sashes, the tall yellow caps. They were, he thought, no more than 200 feet away. Why are they here? He asked himself. Why are they coming toward me? He felt his skin prickle. His stomach hurt. The Hessian officer shouted more words that Jonathan couldn't understand. Without warning, the Hessians began to shift, some to the right and some to the left, until as if by magic, they were no longer 3 in a row, but 10 men to the line, an advancing wall. "Almost!" cried the corporal. Again the Hessian officer shouted. Upon his command, the soldiers lowered their guns. Without missing a step, they snapped their bayonets onto their guns, presenting the glistening blades directly at the Americans. Jonathan tried to swallow. He couldn't. His throat was too stiff, too dry. He was so thirsty. A sudden explosion burst from the American line. Someone had fired. The corporal screamed a curse. His horse reared. Someone else fired. A wave of hysteria welled up inside Jonathan. His arms tensed. Without meaning to, he pulled the trigger. There was a flash and an explosion as the musket jerked against his body, spinning him halfway around. More guns fired. Explosions burst about his ears, the percussion punching him like unseen fists. "Out of my way!" someone screamed at him, roughly shoving him aside. Jonathan almost fell as another man pushed past him. More explosions, this time in front of him. Someone began to cry, "Oh, Lord! Oh, Lord!" Jonathan's ears rang. His eyes were smarting. The air was thick with smoke and stank. He knew that he had to reload and shoot again, but he stood where he was, confused. Why were things happening so quickly? It was unfair. The smoke got thicker. He couldn't see through it to underpinning. On all sides, guns kept shooting. Sometimes they went off 2 at a time. Then came long, terrible, empty pauses when nothing happened at all. Then orange flashes burst through the smoke again. Through it all, Jonathan heard the corporal's voice raging above the din. "In line! In line! In order, idiots! Damn all, in order!" The smoke shifted, briefly lifting. The Hessians moved closer yet, their lines unbroken. Their bayonets thrust forward, their drum pounding, their fife screaming.